Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And like I said, it is one of the key three pillars of risks that we're definitely seeing within the market. I wouldn't necessarily use the word hampering. I would more use the word slowing down. So what I would like to see is this industry has to be a global industry, okay? But what we see now is every country, not every country, I'm exaggerating, but most countries and definitely most regions having their own take on legislation and standards. And a lot of them just taking what they take from the traditional oil and gas or power sectors and trying to push it into the electrolyser market. And therefore, companies who are producing electrolysers have to understand all of this different landscapes. And some of it can be quite trivial, but some of it can be quite major. For example, sending an electrolyser to America or sending it to Europe or send it to Australia can be quite different. And therefore, they have to go through a lot of different processes, a lot of different assurance mechanisms to make sure that their electrolyser is technical capably for each of these different jurisdictions. Like I mentioned as well, it's also a matter of production. So as we move from industrial batch production into more continuous production, some of the requirements of pressure equipment, for example, like PED, is really slowing down some of this manufacturing based on the level of documentation you need and the level of checks you need throughout the process. So there is a need to recognise the different global jurisdiction and legislations and making sure that we can streamline that a little bit. And then also looking at how do we retrofit and make sure that traditional industry legislations and standards meet this new way of manufacturing. And that's even without thinking about some of the issues within the ESG space. So like I spoke about, the purpose of us doing this is to reduce carbon. One of the big things that is hampering or slowing down some of the large scale hydrogen projects is around how are we going to actually determine how green that molecule is. And particularly when you're crossing borders, for example, if you're selling European made green hydrogen into Asia or Middle East made green hydrogen into Asia, etc. And there's that whole piece still at play about how do we actually determine how green that molecule is. So I guess to summarise, some of the legislation is moving slower than the projects. This is a global industry. We have to look at it as a global industry, but the way that legislation and standards at the moment is it's quite country or regional specific, and therefore manufacturers have to get their head around a lot of different legislations to be able to send their electrolysers globally. And then finally, we have to remember that once we produce that green molecule of hydrogen, how are we going to be able to trade it? And at the moment, there's not really that global view of that. One of the other questions I often get asked in this space is around Chinese electrolysers. So if we look at the global capacity of electrolysers at the moment, it's around 25 gigawatts, but 15 gigawatts of that is coming from China. And people often ask me about the standards and the technical capability of them electrolysers. What I say is the biggest green hydrogen production at the moment is in China. Therefore, these technologies absolutely work as an overall broad brush. But what we're not able to do is sometimes get the transparency of the levels of documentation, etc., that we need in order to prove that they are capable to be used within the European or the American or the Australian market. And therefore, this takes more effort, it takes more time, but nobody should absolutely discount these electrolysers as not being technical capable. You just might need to build a bit more time assuring them within the specific markets that you're working in.